When you hear the word fascism today, there is no genuine meaning behind it. Leftists use the word as a way to slander any meaningful criticism and construe it to their own perceived notions of reality. Rightists use the word in different ways, depending on their view of fascism, whether they appropriate it for critique or in praise of it. It is a word that creates more illusion and mystique to the idea than what it actually is, a product of its time. In a new world which focuses on speed, on industrialization, on materialism, an ideology like fascism was certainly bound to occur. To understand fascism, we must first understand what gives a philosophy power, the engine that drives it, if you will. Philosophy is bound by two main components, aesthetics and an explanation of the world around them. Famously, I often tell my friends who I talk to about various issues that the best way to view philosophy is just as secular theology. Philosophy has a grip equivalent to that of religion in terms of how it makes people believe in them. For instance, Marxists on the left and conservatives on the right. Yet fascism is unique as it is a philosophy that is talked about with expertise by many, yet only understood by a few. This lack of understanding is most present when it comes to understanding the aesthetics which dominate fascist philosophy. Many, especially on the political left, view fascism as lockstep with conservatism and even capitalism. Granted, this is because of their own political prescriptions than actual reality. Even academics misdiagnose the actual aesthetics of fascism, the most famous of which is Umberto Eco, the author of Ur-Fascism, a holy book to some in diagnosing potential fascist leaders. Eco's ideas about fascism center around 14 key points. Using these points to diagnose fascism, almost every state before the French Revolution and other authoritarian regimes today, for instance, Stalin's Soviet Union, could be classified as fascist. Now, if we're going to sit up here and say that Stalin, King Louis XVI, and Abraham Lincoln, all of whom would fit the bill for Eco's categories for fascist leaders, are all therefore thus fascists, then at that point, we might as well say the human species is designed to be fascist. However, while Eco's assertion is a grave flaw, it is not his most dangerous when it comes to understanding fascism for what it actually is, rather than the image we paint as a society. Eco's most dangerous notion is his prominent notion when it comes to defining fascistic aesthetics. He asserts that fascism is anti-modernist. Ironically, he is correct, but not in the way in which he portrays fascism to be. Fascism is an anti-modernist philosophy, but not because it harps upon the past, but because it looks to the future. In other words, fascism is by all terms a philosophy designed for the future. However, what makes fascism an ideology that is quite unique in a lot of regards is the fact that although it is an anti-modernist and future-looking philosophy, it also inherits a lot of the character of the nation at the time. The fascism which took over in Germany, embodied by National Socialism, dealt with issues far differently than Italy's classical fascism, to Primo de Rivera's Phalangism, and to Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Each country's history shapes the way that these different fascistic traits manifest in their own countries. Thus, why Mosley's own vision of fascism calls for pacifism, rather than the militarism of Germany and Italy's own version. This video intends to understand fascism through the lens of classical fascism, itself the ancestor of all fascistic movements present in our history and in today's time. It is important, however, to understand how the original fascism came to exist in Italy. Fascism originates not from political theory, but from an artistic movement, Futurism. Futurism as an artistic movement began in Italy during the early 20th century. Its founder was Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Futurism's philosophy and aims as an artistic movement can best be objectified within the book written by Marinetti the same year he first founded the movement, the so-called Manifesto of Futurism. In the manifesto, Marinetti explicitly calls for the rejection and destruction of tradition itself, and instead installing new virtues within the age of industrialism: speed, technology, and youth. This is not conservatism by any metrics. It rejects the past entirely, and it actively calls for the destruction of museums and any other forms of historical preservation. This is not, however, liberalism by any metrics either. It rejects modernity, which liberals intend to live in and improve the condition of while living their lives. Futurism is just what it says it is, a movement for tomorrow. Ironically, the futurists sound more like Luddites when you put it in those terms, not to destroy machinery to preserve the past way of doing things, but rather destroying the past way of doing things to push machinery. It's also best to understand the virtues employed in the futurist belief system in a similar fashion to how Nietzsche would write of the Übermensch: strong, vital, willing to impose their morals upon others, someone not bound by the old ways of thinking, and embracive of aristocratic morality. While the term Übermensch was later appropriated by the National Socialists in Germany, it is also important to understand that Nietzsche's own views were blatantly anti-nationalist and in part philo-Semitic as well. The quote that best summarizes this movement aesthetically, the futurist and fascist movement, and even its own ethics, is from Marinetti's own writing in his manifesto. We want no part of it. The past, we the young, and strong futurists. Before connecting futurism to fascism, let's take a look at the aesthetics of conservatism and liberalism as well. Conservatism's aesthetics can best be perceived through the lens of the Romanticist movement of art during the early 19th century. Figures such as Lord Byron, Benjamin Disraeli, and plenty of other examples to name all wrote about or lived through the ideals of the natural world before industrialization came to predominate. They emphasized natural beauty, societal harmony, and the agrarian way of life. This is perhaps best illustrated in the 1818 piece Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. For those of you unfamiliar with the painting, you have definitely seen it before. It is a picture of a man with a cane looking out over a foggy mountain to the natural unknown. You could tell the power of Romanticism's influence upon the world by the fact today that we use the word romanticizing to illustrate one remembering something within their life with a rose-colored tint to it, never looking upon it with what actually was, but rather what the idea of it was to them. Be it a loved one, be it an old place which they remember, you will never hear the day-to-day, but rather the past memories. It's quite beautiful in a way, and you could tell how it attracts people to the vision. While Romanticism emphasizes the past, there is no one core aesthetic to attribute to liberalism. Liberalism's aesthetics are unique, as they evolve throughout the course of the existence of the philosophy, whether it be on the political capitalization of Romanticism or realism, the absurdity of Dada art, or the blockiness of postmodern art. What makes these aesthetics that are part of this philosophy so unique is that the dependence on the aesthetics also reflects upon the civilization which liberalism inhabits. Look to the Gothic and Roman styles of architecture of America which many admire, and compare it to the drab and corporatized feel of today's American architecture. Just blocks in the sky rather than character. These are both two products of American liberalism's aesthetics, but two different aesthetics, which thus reflect upon the philosophy of American liberalism. But while we reflect upon the aesthetics of various philosophies, it is also important to connect where the aesthetics of futurism overlap and intertwine with the philosophy of fascism. Look no further than Marinetti himself. In the year of 1918, in hopes of pursuing a political presence for futurism in a post-war Italy marked by collective myth in spite of the victory it had actually obtained, Marinetti went on to establish the Italian Futurist Party. Of course, there is no need to write a manifesto for this party, since he had written one almost 10 years before, when first dealing with this aesthetic phenomenon. However, 1 year later in 1919, Marinetti and his Futurist Party would merge with a certain former Italian socialist by the name of Benito Mussolini, joining leagues with the Blackshirts under the Italian Fascist Party banner. Yet there's more. In the same year of realigning futurism and fascism, Marinetti would go on to be a contributor in the release of the original Fascist Manifesto in 1919. Though Marinetti would temporarily leave the party and politics as a whole in 1920, due to his reception of the Fascist Party at the time as a traditionalist party, he would later return 3 years later in 1923, not as some guy who just happened to return back to a good thing going, though Mussolini's Fascist Party had marched on Rome in the previous year and was proclaimed Il Duce and the Prime Minister of Italy. Instead, when Marinetti returned, he served on the Grand Council of Fascism, directly putting him in a major role within Mussolini's fascistic government. However, for those of you still not convinced that Marinetti and thus Futurism's connection to fascism was indicative of the futurist movement being the aesthetic origin to fascism, perhaps the word of Il Duce himself may convince you. In January of 1924, Benito Mussolini gave an interview to Franco-Belgian journalist Maurice de Wolofe, oddly enough the originator for what is today the Miss France pageant show. In this interview, de Wolofe asked about Mussolini's intellectual and aesthetic influences behind this new fascistic idea taking hold in Italy. Mussolini can be quoted in his response as saying, quote, "I have a great admiration for Marinetti. He is an innovator who has done me a great deal of good. He gave me an impulse in life. The fascist movement is undoubtedly born of the spiritual preparation given by Futurism." Hearing those words from the man who personified fascism throughout Europe until Germany's issue, I believe, makes it undeniable that Futurism and fascism are not only linked, but Futurism serves as an integral aesthetic core to the birth of fascism in of itself. While it could go into depth even more and connect figures such as Chronoclast, a prominent futurist who would go on later to sign a manifesto in support of fascist ideology in all forms of art, or Giacomo Balla, a signer of the Futurist Manifesto who ended up designing arts and flags for Mussolini's regime, though eventually retreating from politics entirely, it would be redundant to do a full in-depth look when the substance already exists. With the aesthetics of fascist philosophy defined, it then leaves the actual theory behind it. For this, we must look to the grandest of all fascist philosophers himself, Giovanni Gentile. Gentile's writings include several doctrinal works for fascism, but most importantly of all, he wrote as a ghostwriter for Mussolini in a work titled The Origins and Doctrines of Fascism, first released in 1929. Gentile's work is in many ways a masterpiece for those curious about fascistic ideology for the sake of learning rather than for actual belief. It showcases a far different fascism than the boogeyman conveyed by today's society. However, it is important to note that while this philosophy is often misunderstood, there is a reason for it outside of just pure political motivation. To anyone who is actually tempted to read Gentile's worldview through this book, it is incredibly complex, to the point where you would have to understand centuries of philosophical thought within Europe. With this context in mind, it is important to first present Gentile and fascism's idea for how the world works, albeit briefly before explaining the history behind it. Gentile's justification for the fascistic worldview revolves around the concept of what Gentile calls actual idealism. And while the word seems simple, it is infinitely complex without proper understanding. This idea of actual idealism has its origins in the same place Marxism does, as a matter of fact, Hegelianism, specifically Hegelian dialectics. For those of you who are into philosophy in the audience, or even within the field of history, you are probably familiar with the idea. But for those unfamiliar with the concept, the best way to describe it is as an explanation for the process of history. What before would be considered as natural law would be explained through Hegel and the spirit of human consciousness and knowledge throughout history, with dialectics being the way in which progress was obtained. First, a thesis, a statement made. Then an antithesis, a statement counteractive to what was made. Then a synthesis, a combination of the correct ideas of both statements into one truth, which in turn would become a new thesis. This is how Hegel, and later Marx and Gentile, would come to define history. Marx's own dialectics, known to his supporters as dialectical materialism, which in itself deserves a future deep dive into the idea, is where history and dialectics played out exclusively through this means of socio-economic developments and clashes. For instance, a class war between the masters and slaves created the original dynamic of the ancient world. Or, from Marx's own words, a class war between the Ancien regime and the bourgeoisie capitalist class. These socio-economic conflicts driven by material issues is what drives the wheel of history, rather than some deeper spiritual meaning. In other words, there is no greater spirit that drives human consciousness like Hegel's dialectics, which he terms the Geist, but just the inevitability of material conditions failing until global communism is reached. With this rudimentary understanding of dialectics and the grander idealism which characterized the thought of Hegel and his descendants, It is now important to distinguish what makes Gentile's actual idealism such a unique form of the dialectical process. Gentile's dialectics come down to the traditional Hegelian dialectics, that being thesis meets antithesis creates synthesis, but with the condition that instead of this being a long, played-out process as presupposed by Hegel and later Marx, Gentile's dialectics end up being played out on a much shorter timescale. In fact, Gentile believes that the only thing that is real is the act of thinking, or what he considered to be the consciousness of the self at the present moment. In other words, in the dialectics of Gentile, dialectics are instant and recurring. In the world of Gentile, a thesis is instantly opposed by an antithesis, which brings about an instant synthesis, and so on and so forth. Gentile's philosophy, thus, if you think about it, is incredibly modern, to the point where only the present is what exists. The past is gone with the previous dialectical equation. To evaluate Gentile's meaning, we should look at his own words to describe what he means. In one of his writings titled The Reform of Education, Gentile would write of reality. Quote, "The reality is not the thought, but the thinking. We see then that the mind is an act of thinking. It is the pure act." Chapter 5. In other words, while he is not futuristic like the previously mentioned futurists, which he would consider a reactionary to, Gentile believes that only the present matters, since that it is the only moment where the consciousness of self exists is within the present moment, i.e., Gentile believes his philosophy is to be continually modern. This is perhaps why fascism as well had no problem spreading to other nations, though, collecting certain characteristics and cultural heritage points of several different fascistic regimes as it came to power in different countries. Spain's Phalangism, Germany's National Socialism, and all the other fascistic or fascistic-inspired movements came to be forged by the iron of fascism mined by Gentile, Mussolini, and the futurists, with the flames of their own history being what gives the fascistic ideology shape in these countries. This also explains as well as to why fascist movements would copy traditional and ancient symbology and thus give off the appearance of traditionalism, when in reality it is being incredibly modern in the eyes of Gentile and the fascists. For instance, Italy used the Roman salute, the fasces, and reinvigorated the building and uses of traditional Greco-Roman architecture in their society. But not because of calling back to the good old days. These were symbols of a time of a stronger Italy, after all. Rather, all of these traditional items were used because fascism doesn't intend to truly embody the symbols, but rather use the act of thinking to will them into existence under their own modern manifestation of reality. This is in a similar sense to how Germany distorted ancient Hindu imagery and anthropological stories of the Indo-Aryan migrations into their own story. It's probably also explainable of why later on figures would delve into the ideas of national origin and esotericism. However, in the case of Italy, Gentile would employ his description of fascism to a new man and a new Italy, one forged by unity, loyalty to Il Duce, and the recognition of the merger of the state with all facets of life. This description of the new man and the new Italy, one common trait amongst all the fascistic regimes, also leads to a great misconception of fascism, and this is one many people fall into, with good and fair reason, no malice behind it. If you've watched my video, America's Rubicon, The Inevitability of Empire, you may see where this is going. In his writings on the origins and doctrines of fascism, Gentile described his qualms with liberalism and democracy in general. However, these criticisms, in particular about democracy, are not a dismissal of the political system, more a dismissal of the framing of it. Gentile complained about how liberals view democracy, saying, quote, "Fascism is opposed to the democracy which identifies peoples with the greatest number of individuals and reduces them to a majority level." When Gentile refers to identifying democracy as the greatest number of individuals, this is a direct reference to the liberalism which predominated Anglo-American thought behind democracy, being inherently individualist, the idea of one man, one vote may come to mind. The majority level also infers the idea of elections and the fact that not all of the individuals in the state where these elections are held may agree with the people in charge or the ideas that will be pushed by these people. Gentile's qualms aren't necessarily dismissive of democracy as a concept either. In fact, Gentile believes fascism to be true democracy, or in his own words, democrazia vera. Now, my Italian's not that good, but in the same sentence right after the previous quote where Gentile talks about fascism's opposition to liberal democracy, he states, quote, "But fascism can be considered the most perfect form of democracy if the people are conceived, as they should be, qualitatively and not quantitatively. Fascism's view of itself, therefore, is not that it is opposed to democracy, but it is in fact the most democratic of all philosophies. So how would fascism define its own democracy? Fascist democracy, in comparison to liberal democracy, believes that unity is the goal of democracy, not plurality, that the leaders of democracy are the embodiment of the spirit of the nation, not just mere representatives, that the state is not just an instrument of power, but the reality where freedom lies, not in individuality, but through unity with the nation. It is, in a sense, a response to the disunity of industrial mass politics which inhabited late 19th and early 20th century societies, which led to unrest and chaos that led to the mass politics which would come to dominate all of the West." What makes this idea even more interesting is the amount of familiarity it has to Marxist philosophy. Marx talks about the concept of alienation and how capitalism has devalued man to a point where it has put chains upon the nature of man and provided 4 different ways in which capitalism has alienated man from his nature. Alienation from the product of labor, alienation from the act of production, alienation from species being, i.e., the ability for man to be creative, and alienation from other people. When pairing it with fascism and the concept of the new man, this alienation is also innate within fascistic theory. Man is alienated from his product of labor, alienated from the act of production, alienated from species being, and alienated from other people. Both philosophies require consciousness, but both diverge into forms of what consciousness ought to be achieved. Marxism holds that it is class consciousness that must be obtained for man to finally break his chains. But for fascism, it is national consciousness for man to finally break his chains. Thus, the new man born from fascism is in a lot of sense the new man born from Marxism. That is one that is loyal to his nation or loyal to his class and able to pursue what he wishes. Now, while I don't classify fascism as a left-wing ideology, it is certainly not conservative or right-wing either. I do prefer the classification which is used by genuine fascists, that is, that they are neither left nor right, but rather a wholly unique third position, since it incorporates some of the ideas of the right and the left while being wholly unique. The best way to describe this comparison in layman terms is to look at Hegel's vision of what predominates history versus Marx's vision of what predominates history. Spiritualism versus materialism, in a sense. Yet, there is still good evidence from one of the most prominent fascists in history to suggest that fascism may indeed be left-wing. At least this is what someone would bring up if they were trying to make that point. Oswald Mosley, founder and organizer of the British Union of Fascists, and later an advocate along with Francis Schiacchi, a lesser-known but fairly interesting fascist thinker, for the idea of the European state, a more centralized European Union, if you will, towards the end of his life began to start a public circuit, explaining his views and why he believed and still believed in them. This public circuit was in part out of his own pride, as he wished to write his own story rather than let academics and historians write it out, as he would be fairly active in the media and would offer interviews to clarify himself. When seeing that he was being characterized as conservative or right-wing, Mosley, still a fervent believer in the third position, had distanced himself from the individual nation-state fascism, as seen by his own advocacy for pan-Europeanism, and would pen an open letter to the Times, which would appear in the April 26, 1968 version of the newspaper, stating bluntly, quote, "I am not, and never have been, a man of the right. My position was on the left, and now in the center of politics." With Umberto Eco in mind, I think before ending this video, it is important to talk about what Eco actually characterized accurately with Ur-Fascism, rather than what he envisioned. Eco's vision of Ur-Fascism came from a position from someone with openly left-wing views. This assertion, however, is not because of my own thoughts about him, but rather what he actually said about himself. In a 2011 interview with The Guardian titled Umberto Eco, People Are Tired of the Simple Things, They Want to Be Challenged, he would go on to openly classify himself as a moderate leftist and talk about his history within left-wing political organizations dating back to his work as a partigiano, a partisan, during the Second World War. Eco's vision of fascism, like it is with most leftists, is thus tainted by their own bias rather than what it really was. It is important to remember, after all, that Eco was only a child at the time the Second World War ended. However, it is important to state how Eco did correctly characterize a political phenomenon, not fascism, however. Eco characterized socially conservative authoritarianism in quite a powerful way, something which I think most people can objectively agree with, as do I. But that does not mean he's correct about fascist philosophy. Fascism, as a philosophy, is an interesting one. It is wholly dynamic and adaptable, but at the same time unachievable within any sense in the modern world. The misconceptions behind fascism which people have are in a sense reasonable to a degree. I don't blame the average person for thinking fascism is reactionary or anti-democratic or whatever they may say about it. A lot of it comes from purposely pushed and defended academic talking points, which comes to harm an actual understanding of society, rather than viewing something objectively and taking the moral arguments out of it. If you've gotten to this point in the video, I think it is fair to say that you have certainly learned a lot more about fascism and how it actually views itself. It is a video which I think is important to put out because fascism is one of the most lied about things in our world today. I am not an advocate for fascism, nor do I claim to be. I simply am here to state the truth about what fascism actually is: a futuristic and mechanically aesthetic, and an ultra-modern philosophy in the eyes of the people who actually created it. And I'll be honest, a lot of my research to this video actually goes back to when I was in college, when I wrote an article debunking the claims of a prominent leftist on my campus about the link of fascism to nostalgia and asserting that Edmund Burke, the originator of modern conservatism, was in fact the ideological grandfather or father to fascism. I wrote it primarily for one reason, because I saw the original article as a disingenuous article written by someone who had not done any research and just put pen to paper about something he read about. I guess in a lot of ways, that spirit comes out in this channel when I talk about history, philosophy, or any other social science, because I genuinely love the topics and enjoy talking about them purely through what they said, rather than through any ideological lens. I implore you to tell me in the comments section if you've changed your mind about fascism, or even if you just like the video, because my goal here is simple: to give the facts and illustrate the truth behind a less explored person or idea, or to correct the narrative which leads to misinformation and misunderstanding when it comes to our story as human beings. With all that said, I hope that you enjoyed this video and learned something new about fascism or even history in general.